It was the day before Thanksgiving, November 24, 1971, a cramped Boeing 727, a polite man with a briefcase, a flight attendant's casual smile. Within an hour the aircraft would become the stage for a crime that reads like a pulpy thriller. The man handed a note to a flight attendant, said he had a bomb, demanded cash and parachutes, and then under the cover of night and cloud climbed down the aircraft's rear staircase and vanished into the bitter Pacific Northwest sky with $200,000 tied to his chest.
He was never seen again. The money, for decades, became a ghost. Nearly all of it simply disappeared. What followed was a decades-long hunt, strange discoveries on riverbanks, innumerable theories, a parade of suspects, and a single haunting question that refuses to die. What happened to D.B. Cooper and where did the money go? Please help this channel grow, like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was an ordinary short hop from Portland to Seattle, a route packed with holiday travelers and commuters. Among the 36 passengers and 6 crew was an unremarkable man who bought a one-way ticket under the name Dan Cooper. He was described by witnesses as calm, neat, and sober mid-40s, trim, wearing a dark suit. He sat quietly, ordered a bourbon and soda, and folded a paper napkin into his palm. Nobody imagined that napkin would become the wedge that split an ordinary afternoon from an unsolvable mystery. The victims in this story were not the typical victims of violent crime. They were the stewardesses and crew whose lives were forced into a night of fear, the passengers who would be evacuated in Seattle only to watch the drama escalate, the family members of those on board who later wrestled with the public spectacle, and in a way that would ripple for decades the public itself, which would come to idolize and demonize the stranger who stepped off a plane and into myth. The suspect was a man we never truly knew, only glimpses, a clipped accent, a cigarette stub, sunglasses in the cabin light, a clipped, calm voice. He was methodical, polite, and precise traits that made his disappearance all the more inexplicable. When Cooper handed the note to Florence Schaffner, a flight attendant, the paper requested $200,000 in bills, a hefty sum in 1971, for parachutes and a refueling stop. He made a point to be clear, unhurried. He was not a screaming, violent man. He was a negotiator with a plan. On landing in Seattle, the airline and authorities complied. Passengers were released. The FBI would later call it both an extortion and an act of air piracy. The crew obeyed his instructions because the alternative, they feared, could mean mass death. Seattle-Tacoma International on a gray November afternoon. Ground crews, lawmen, airport officials. The ransom, bundled into freshly marked $20 bills, was handed to the hijacker. He allowed the passengers to leave. He kept several crew members aboard to pilot to his next destination. After refueling and with the plane now carrying his cargo and his co-conspirators, the terrified crew, he ordered the pilots to head toward Mexico City, but first, a climb to a specific altitude and a prescribed airspeed. His directions were technical. He knew what he wanted from the aircraft. That confidence terrified and mystified investigators. Whoever he was, he understood airplanes. After takeoff from Seattle, the Boeing 727's rear air stair, a rare, retractable door on that model, was lowered in flight. Somewhere over the thick, evergreen wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, in cold wind and night, D.B. Cooper disappeared. He had attached one parachute to the bag of money. Witnesses later said the other parachutes were not properly used. He jumped into weather that could freeze a man in moments. Rain, darkness, uneven terrain. To this day, whether he survived the jump is the subject of heated debate. Some investigators believed he died almost immediately. Others proposed he found sanctuary and vanished into a new life. No corpse, no confirmed trace of a person, and in the immediate aftermath, no proven path for the money. This was not a brazen, cinematic holdup. It was intimate. The stewardesses later recalled how calm and matter-of-fact he had been. He spoke in precise language, requested a whiskey, tucked a handkerchief into his lap. That calm became a cold knot. How could such a quiet man orchestrate such calculation? For the crew, the emotional residue was deep. A quiet terror that never quite left them, the gnawing question of responsibility, and the public spotlight that followed every testimony. For passengers, a mixture of relief, guilt, and a lingering sense that ordinary life had been stepped over by extraordinary danger. The investigation began immediately. FBI agents descended and scoured manifests, luggage, and the aircraft. They collected fingerprints and the odd personal clue, a clip-on tie, a tie clip, parachute remnants, and boot prints that told a partial story. The stewardess's recollections, when translated into artist sketches, produced several composites, the face that would come to be known across tabloid front pages and conspiracy forums. A bungled transcription by a journalist turned the alias Dan Cooper into the legend's more famous name, D.B. Cooper. The world, hungry for a villain and a puzzle, took that misprint and turned it into a mythic tag. The FBI released serial numbers of the ransom bills to the public and constructed a timeline of the flight path and probable jump zone. They gathered witness statements about his demeanor, clothing, and behavior. They became detectives of atmosphere as much as of fact, piecing together the rhythm of the man where he might have trained before, how he would have navigated the plane in the dark, what sort of survival skills he might have possessed. Each guess spawned new lines of inquiry. Each dead end magnified the mystery. For years, the ransom money was the central ghost. Imagine $200,000 in 197, bundled, heavy, traceable by serial numbers simply evaporating from the record. Then, nearly a decade later, a child raking sand on a Columbia riverbank discovered 3 packets of $20 bills about $5,800 buried and water-worn. The notes matched the serial numbers released by investigators. They were like a breadcrumb from a fairy tale, tantalizing proof, but also maddeningly incomplete. Where was the rest? How had those packets arrived at that particular river bend? Were they dropped from the sky, washed downstream, buried deliberately? The discovery intensified public fascination and reopened debate about Cooper's field. The money's condition nearly disintegrated, yet still in ordered bundles baffled forensic scientists and ecologists. Some argued the bills had been in the bank of a river for years, eroded by time and tides. Others posited they came from a buried cache that had been disturbed. Theories proliferated: an accident in which the money fell from a parachute and was scattered by water, a carefully concealed stash unearthed by a curious child, a staged finding meant to mislead investigators. The money, when it appeared, did not close the case, it reopened it in a dozen directions. Over the decades, thousands of theories surfaced. Some focused on survival. Did Cooper die in hypothermia during the jump? Others argued he lived, reinvented himself, and settled under another name. Suspects were proposed: professional skyjumpers, ex-paratroopers, local oddballs with contested alibis. Several men were investigated intensely. None were ever charged. Theories ranged from plausible to extraordinary: that the hijacker was a military man, a stuntman, a con artist with aviation knowledge, or a desperate bank robber who calculated the odds perfectly. Each suspect spawned books, podcasts, documentaries, and amateur sleuths who scanned public records and scanned old photographs. The investigation became not only a law enforcement effort but a cultural obsession. As the years turned into decades, the D.B. Cooper case became fertile ground for amateur detectives. Every new theory found an audience, every small clue, a faded jacket, a scrap of fabric, a reanalyzed fingerprint was amplified. The case migrated from police files to airports of the imagination, barroom arguments, forums, and conventions dedicated to the man who dropped out of the sky. The FBI's mountain of evidence became a public puzzle box filed in boxes, scanned into archives, dissected in documentaries. The more the agency released, the more public sleuths gathered to fill gaps with speculation, sometimes producing new leads, sometimes false hopes. There was never a trial. There were no convictions. The hijacker D.B. Cooper was never apprehended, charged, or brought before a court. The FBI pursued numerous leads over the decades, but arrests never came. Eventually, in 2016, after 45 years of investigation, the FBI announced it was suspending active investigation of the case, closing the dedicated task force while leaving the case technically unsolved in the archives, a symbolic capitulation and an admission that, with the evidence at hand, prosecution was unlikely. The legal record ended not with a verdict but with absence. No person held accountable, no courtroom drama, only the slow tick of unsolved case files. The legal emptiness of the outcome feeds both sorrow and fascination. For victims, the crew, the passengers, there was no judicial closure. For the public, the absence of resolution has been a magnet, inviting speculation and conspiracy to fill the vacuum. The criminal act remains, in legal terms, a ghost. We know it happened, but not who carried it out. The money, mostly, remained missing. The partial discovery on the Columbia River area raised more puzzles than it solved, and the remaining bulk of the ransom vanished into the Pacific Northwest's dark geography and the country's collective imagination. D.B. Cooper entered American folklore the way only the most enigmatic crimes can, as a mirror for anxieties and a playground for image-making. He became the subject of books that alternately revered and vilified him, the figure in countless documentaries, the model for the gentleman criminal archetype in pop culture. Airlines tightened security in the industry's first steps toward modern screening protocols. The case changed how people think about airport safety and the vulnerabilities of commercial aviation. And in towns along the Columbia River and in online forums around the globe, the spirit of the case persisted, a perfect unsolved crime that invited participation and debate. The most haunting part of this story is not the daring use of a parachute at night or the crisp bundles of $20 bills washed up on a riverbank years later. It is the way absence acquired presence. A man's identity and the bulk of his loot evaporated into weather, time, and possibility. Families and investigators carried forward the memory of a man they never knew. The public carried forward the riddle. The partial recovery of the bills on the Columbia River was not a solution but a reminder that small facts can keep a mystery alive, and small discoveries can push new questions into the dark. If there is an emotional truth here, it is this: the loss remains not only of money but of certainty. For the crew who lived that day, the loss was the sense that normal life could be interrupted by something grotesquely ordinary, a man with a briefcase. For the investigators and citizen sleuths, it was the loss of a final answer. And for us as witnesses across the decades, the loss is the lesson that some stories refuse to end on our terms. We are left, instead, with fragments, sketches, serial numbers, a handful of bills, and the stubborn human need to know. The D.B. Cooper case will probably never be neatly closed in a court of law, but it will never be closed in the human imagination. That's why, every time the wind whistles through the pines in the Pacific Northwest, someone somewhere will whisper his name and ask again, who jumped from the back of that plane, and where did the money go?